And we are picking up after the contentious events that happened in Kansas, bleeding Kansas, the contention spilling over into the Congress with the caning of Charles Sumner. If we think that we are in a time of great divisiveness and tension now, we really should understand that we haven't yet gotten to, we're getting close, I think, but we haven't gotten to the point that that America had reached in 1856. So there was an election in 1856, and I want to cover that because in this election you have the new political party, the Republicans, with their first presidential candidate. A man who was a war hero, who led our troops in the seizing of California from Mexico. A man by the name of John Fremont, whose nickname was the Pathfinder. This is who the Republicans put forth as their nominee. The Republican platform was they wanted federal funding to complete a transcontinental railroad across the country, as well as other transportation improvements. The Republicans absolutely denounced the repeal of the Missouri Compromise. Remember, there had been legislation in order to kind of get around it at first, and then there was a call to get rid of it or repeal it. But Republicans opposed that vehemently. They also opposed territorial expansion. And then this is what's key about the Republican platform. I want you to know this for our exam. They abhorred slavery, and they were outright against it and wanted to abolish it. This is the first time that a major party had opposed slavery on their platform. First time that it was out in the open outright. On the Democratic side, they endorsed James Buchanan. And there is an interesting fact that I want you to be aware of on page 466 of your text. When the Democrats nominated James Buchanan, they did something that has never been done in presidential politics except this one time. You see, Democrat Franklin Pierce was the president from 52 to 56. And in nominating James Buchanan, they dumped President Pierce, and he is the only elected president to be denied a renomination by his party. That's kind of in the middle of the page next to the map. Pierce, in their minds, had been a complete dud. So they dumped him and nominated James Buchanan. There was a similar development in the 2016 election, and again, it's vaguely similar, but usually after a two-term president, such as Barack Obama, many times the party will nominate that person's vice president to be president. For example, after Reagan served his 2 terms, George Bush ran for the Republicans, older George Bush. Well, in 2016, we know that the Democrats did not choose Biden, they chose Hillary. So that was kind of unusual for them not to choose the current vice president. But anyway, Franklin Pierce has that distinction of being the only president to not be put up for renomination. The Democrats endorsed for their platform the Kansas-Nebraska Act. They called for a vigorous endorsement of the Fugitive Slave Law. Remember, that was a very controversial law. And then the Democrats supported a movement that said Congress should not interfere with slavery in the states or the territories. So kind of the state rights issue coming to the surface there. Congress, they're going outside of their limits when they're trying to mess with slavery in individual states or territories. Welcome, Arcoma, Jay and Madison. I'll catch you up with what we talked about at break time concerning some assignments. We are discussing right now the election of 1856, which is the election that is following the very volatile situation of Bleeding Kansas and the caning of Charles Sumner in the Senate. So the election of 1856 was won by the Democrat James Buchanan. And he really wasn't a strong president. He was kind of timid. Now, there was also some major events that really hurt his presidency, but those things combined with his timid, vacillating personality did not help him at all. Number one, as far as the major events, the Dred Scott versus Sandford Supreme Court case in 1857. Put a star by the Dred Scott case. You'll need to know that. Dred Scott versus Sandford. Dred Scott had been a runaway slave who made it into the North. He eventually settled in 2 states and got married and had a family and basically became a citizen in those states. So the Dred Scott case was he considered a free citizen as far as the United States was concerned. And the Supreme Court ruled that slaves, even if they had lived in a northern state for some time, slaves, because he was a slave at first, slaves were not U.S. citizens. And they also ruled, the Supreme Court, also ruled that Congress could not prohibit slavery in the territories. That is, new territories coming into the Union, but they have not reached that 60,000 population yet to apply for statehood. So, for example, Nebraska or Kansas, if they picked their House and their Senate in their state legislature, the federal Congress could not ban slavery. That would be a state issue or a territory issue. A second major event that really hurt Buchanan's presidency was a situation in Kansas called the Lee-Compton Constitution situation in Kansas in 1857 and 58. You had a pro-slavery legislation in Kansas meet and come up with a constitution, which the governor vetoed it. Then the legislators vetoed the governor's, or they overrode the governor's veto. The governor resigned in protest. President Buchanan replaced him, and the new governor pledged to free state Kansas citizens that the new Constitution would have a fair vote. They were going to replace this pro-slavery Constitution. So they met in Lee-Compton, Kansas. That's why it's called the Lee-Compton Constitution. But what happened was under this Constitution, it was said that Kansas would become a slave state. So that caused some problems for Buchanan. And then another financial panic was a major crisis that affected Buchanan's presidency, the financial panic of 1857. The U.S. economy was growing so fast, and transportation innovations and options were increasing, but the demand for American corn and wheat by Europe was decreasing. So we were building all these new transportation means, but we were exporting less and less corn and wheat. So the Panic of 1857. And of course, during this time of Buchanan's presidency, you still had the tension between the North and the South over slavery. We could say that all of these things happening were like a, the old Looney Tune cartoons where Bugs Bunny or whoever, since we talked about Bugs Bunny earlier, they get all the TNT and dynamite and they're going to blow something up and they stack it full and whatever. We could say that during this time, the TNT and the powder and the dynamite are being stacked and stacked and stacked, just waiting for the right fuse or the right spark to cause a great explosion. Do you have any questions on this election of 1856? So once again, know about the Republican platform. Specifically know this one aspect of it, that they were the first major party to oppose slavery. Know about Franklin Pierce being the only U.S. president to not receive a renomination. And no, the Dred Scott versus Sanford Supreme Court case. All right, we're going to move on to pre-election events. That is events before the 1860 election that were significant. Number one, the rise of Abraham Lincoln in Illinois. Lincoln had served for a little bit in his state, but he kind of stepped down. And then in 1858, he stepped back into the political arena, running as a congressman in Illinois, running for congressman in Illinois, running against Stephen Douglas, and had actually debates with Stephen Douglas from August 21st to October 15th, 1858. And it was this little short guy, Douglas Stevens, a little over 5 feet tall, and Abraham Lincoln at 6'4". So it was kind of a humorous looking setup whenever they would debate. Lincoln or Douglas was characterized as someone who was only interested in the process, that is, allow states to have popular sovereignty, let the states decide if they want to be slave or free. And so, remember, Douglas also wanted to have Chicago as the hub for the Transcontinental Railroad. So he kind of stayed neutral when it came to the slave issue, allow the states to decide. So it was said that he was only interested in the process. Lincoln said he focused on principle, that he wanted to abolish slavery. And when we say that, what we mean is slavery that already existed in slave states would remain. They would not, Lincoln did not want to get rid of slavery in the slave states. He just wanted to keep it from spreading into new territories. So no more expansion of slavery. So he said he was a person of principle. And he was like many of the other Northerners who were not abolitionists completely. His hopes was that eventually slavery would die out in the South. Some other important events that happened before the election of 1860. You had more free states than slave states. Minnesota joined in May of 1858. Oregon joined in February of 1859. And this tipped the balance of more free states in the Union than slave states. And this tension also caused the largest brawl, B-R-A-W-L, in Congress in 1858. One guy got on the floor of the House and said some harsh things about slavery, and it just became a free-for-all, knockdown, drag-out. Could you imagine CNN and MSNBC and Fox covering a brawl today in our Congress? They might have the biggest ratings ever. Finally, it ended when a guy by the name of John Bowie Knife Potter of Wisconsin, I can only imagine that he carried a Bowie knife around with him. He yanked off one of the Massachusetts senator's wigs. And he claimed, "I've scalped him." And that kind of brought an end to it. Who says history is not funny, right? A third thing, and this is an important thing for the events before 1860. You recall a guy named John Brown, who was anti-slavery, radical. He had attacked that town in Kansas and contributed to the Bleeding Kansas crisis in 1858, or 1856, sorry. In October of 1859, he launched his final all-out attempt to end slavery. And he led a 2-day rebellion. Let me bring up my slides here. All righty. So what we're talking about here is John Brown's raid on Harper's Ferry, Virginia. Let me show you where that is on a map. I know I have a map with Harper's Ferry, but maybe I don't. Maybe I do, maybe I don't. Looks like I don't, but that's okay. I remember where it is. It is up here in this region that Harper's Ferry was located. So John Brown led a raid on this town. There's a nice, handsome picture of John Brown. A 2-day raid or rebellion, October 16 through the 18th of 1859. His goal was to raid the munitions house, get the arms, and to arm slaves and trigger an uprising. So this raid took place for this rebellion took place for 2 days and eventually was put down. And John Brown was eventually executed for his sedition. The textbook mentions that the day he was hanged on December 2nd, 1859, a young stage actor by the name of John Wilkes Booth was in the crowd to watch Brown be executed. And then another major thing about the election, before the election of 1860, is the Democrat Party divided. The Democrat Party is still the only major party in the United States that is located all throughout the United States. The Republicans were only located in the North. So the Democrats divided. You had a pro-slavery faction, and they elected a man by the name of John Breckinridge. Here we go. Here's the four men. John Breckinridge, who would support a federal slave code in territories. The other group in the Democrats still supported Stephen Douglas. He opposed federal slave codes, but he and Breckinridge still supported popular sovereignty. The Republicans, of course, nominated Abraham Lincoln. No more slavery in the new territories, and wherever slavery exists, it will only remain there. It will not spread. So it's already looking bad for the Democrats. And then you have another little faction kind of break away. They called themselves the Constitutional Union, and they just wanted to avoid the slavery issue and keep the country united. So that too also hurt the Democrats. So in 1860, November, Abraham Lincoln, 52-year-old Republican from Illinois, becomes our 16th president. Many people in his party, many of the leaders were not too, they didn't see too much promise in his presidency because he had little experience politically. They didn't think he could handle the tensions that were already existing between the North and the South. And so they didn't have a lot of faith in him being able to lead the country during this time. So we'll pick up there after our break. 10:16, let's take a 5-minute break. We'll start back up at 10:21. For those of you in Arcoma, I'm going to bring up our course homepage. And if one of you has your laptop, I need you to check this out for me.
I have a question.
Okay.
So, you know how we had the incident with that test that I took, or the test we took?
The test 3?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Are you gonna, like, delete that and then have me resubmit it again, or do you just want me to email it to you?
I've already cleared it, so you can resubmit it.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, thank you. All right, so if one of you are on the course homepage, go to the module page, go to module 4, and I think we've got it all taken care of, but I just need you to check for me on the final assignment of the semester, which is in blog 4 about the, module 4. The assignment is a blog about Oklahoma Civil War battles. Click on the title and just make sure that when you do that, you see the assignment here, but above it you see create blog entry. And that's how you click on that, and then you enter your first, second, third entry. Do you guys see that? Okay, very good. And so since we had issues with that, I extended that due date until May 8th instead of May 3rd. So you still have 8 days to get those blogs submitted. Alrighty, so we got 3 more minutes. Okay, let's, I got to hustle here because I want to get all of our stuff in today and Thursday. The election of 1860, Lincoln won it without one single electoral vote in the South. And this outraged the South, that a president could take office without one single vote from the South. They also were, of course, opposed to his platform of no extension of slavery. So he was elected in November of 1860. He does not take office until March 4th. So about 4 months' time. You know, nowadays it's only about 2 months' time from November to January. So in that interim period, you had a southern state, South Carolina, in December. They voted to leave or secede from the Union. December 12th, 1860. By February 1st of 1861, you had 7 states total that has seceded from the Union. Alabama, Florida, Georgia, Louisiana, Mississippi, and Texas all joined South Carolina. They meet in Montgomery, Alabama, and delegates from those 7 states, and they form the new country called the Confederate States of America, draw up their own constitution, and they elect Jefferson Davis as their president. Now, they met in Alabama, Montgomery, Alabama. That was the first capital. But when Virginia, remember, Virginia is not in the first 7 here, but when Virginia, let me go back up here, no, down. When Virginia also secedes, the capital is moved to Richmond, Virginia. So this map here shows these 7 states here, the lower South, they were called, Texas, all the way across to South Carolina. These were the first 7 states to secede. 4 more states, Virginia, North Carolina, Tennessee, Arkansas, joined the South. And the dates for their secession are up here. April, May, and June. So these 4 states joined after Lincoln was inaugurated. Virginia was the 8th state to secede, and Richmond, Virginia became the capital of the Confederacy. The Confederate States also, and this is still the bottom 7, the lower 7, they also seized some of the forts, some of the military forts, and a key one was Fort Sumter, which is a fort built on a man-made island in the harbor of Charleston, South Carolina. And they surrounded that fort and demanded that the fort submit. And the general of the fort at that time refused to do so. So when Lincoln was inaugurated on March 4th, you had 7 states that had already seceded. You had forts that had been attacked and taken over, and you still had Fort Sumter, still under siege. So immediately Lincoln began to attend to the Fort Sumter crisis. On April 4th of 1861, he ordered ships to go to Fort Sumter and resupply it. Jefferson Davis countered with their own ships to keep the Union from helping the fort. On April 12th of 1861, the Confederates start to shell the fort. On April 13th, Fort Sumter, under Union command, surrenders to the Confederates, and this marks the beginning of the Civil War. No April 13th, 1861. as the beginning of the Civil War. So all of that powder and dynamite and TNT went off. We could say maybe it was lit when Lincoln was elected, and it was a long fuse that slowly burned until April 13th. Okay, so these slides I'll put on the course page today. You'll want to know this top one, causes leading up to the Civil War, starting with the Missouri Compromise in 1820. This will be similar to the American Revolutionary timeline. All right, so here's another map showing the division. Free states are the darker blue, and Missouri, Kentucky, West Virginia, Maryland, and Delaware. At the time, West Virginia was still a part of Virginia. You can see it became a separate state in 1863. But at first, these states stayed neutral. Here, this kind of shows their discoloration. And then you had these territories, which were part of the reason why the war began, because the South wanted slavery to be able to expand into some of these territories. Now, before we talk about some of the battles of the Civil War, I wanted to show you this map. And this is the northern portion of Virginia, the yellow here. So Washington, the District of Columbia, is this little section here that was carved out of Maryland and Virginia on the Potomac River. So that's the District of Columbia, DC. That's where our nation's capital is. And that's where it would have been, that's where it was for the Civil War. Lincoln was in the White House here. About 100 miles to the south is the Confederate capital of Richmond, Virginia. So, in a war in which the territories or the sections were this large, and you could say all the way from northern Maine to the southern tip of Texas, that's a long distance, that's a lot of area. The capitals of both sections are so close in proximity to each other. So let's share about the plans, the battle strategies of the North and the South. The South adopted a plan called the Anaconda Plan. It's a great name. And this was put forth by the Mexican War hero, Winfield Scott. This plan called for the Union to go back up to this map very quickly. The main Union Army would protect Washington, D.C., but then they would also, a part of them would try to push south and take Richmond, right? Take the capital of your opponent. Also, while the main Union Army was up here trying to meet that objective, the Union Navy would form a blockade at major ports of the southern states. Excuse me. Blockade Charleston, blockade New Orleans, and other major ports, because the South was still, they still produced cotton, and cotton was king, and they were still exporting cotton to England and other European countries. So the North wanted to cut off that trading and cut off the financial, the economic provision that the South received from Great Britain and France. So the main Union Army up here in Virginia, naval blockade along the coast of the southern states, and then the third part of his strategy, and this is where the name Anaconda comes from, is the rest of the troops for the Union would slowly march down the inland water routes, Tennessee River, Cumberland River, and especially the Mississippi River. March down those water routes and, win battles and gain control of major cities. And as they did it, it would be like an anaconda wrapping its coils around its prey and slowly squeezing the life. And so the anaconda here would start up here in the Washington, D.C. area with the Union Army, the main army, the Navy going all the way, snaking down the coast and around it. And then, of course, blockading New Orleans, getting control of the Mississippi River, while the other Union troops are coming down the rivers this way. So a fairly offensive strategy for the Union. And there it is, the Anaconda Plan. Blockade the ports, split the Confederacy, and capture Richmond. And you can see by gaining the Mississippi River, they're going to cut off Arkansas, Louisiana, and Texas. The Confederate strategy was basically a defensive battle. And so they would strike, they would have an offensive strategy by having a strong defense. And so they would protect Richmond. And if the opportunity presented itself, they would push north and try to capture Washington, D.C. But their main thing was to defend their capital. They also wanted to prolong the war as long as possible and make the North get tired. get tired of fighting, and eventually give up. They also wanted to prolong the war long enough so that either the French or the English or both of them would join in their cause. They wanted to be seen as a legitimate nation. And so if they could hold off the North, then maybe the British or the France or both would see them as a viable nation and they would jump in to help. Also, along with the strategy to move north eventually and get Washington, D.C., if other opportunities opened up for them to advance northward and take Northern Territory, they would do it. So you could say it was a very defensive strategy that was always looking for opportunities to basically get off their heels and give themselves some breathing room and move north. Let's talk about some of the battles of the Civil War. These slides have the 10 deadliest battles. I want to highlight some of the key battles before November of 1862, before September of 1862, key battles there then. And then we'll pick up next week with key battles from the last part of 1862 until the end of the war. But so of course, Fort Sumter was a short battle, and the Confederates won that in April of 1861. And they gained control of Fort Sumter, and the war begins. 3 months later, in July of 1861, you had the battle, the first battle of Bull Run. And that was up here on this map. Maybe not. Let me go back in here. Excuse me. So you can see here on this map, this kind of these ridges here. In this area is the Shenandoah Valley of Virginia. And that Battle of Bull Run was up in this area. And so this was the first battle between troops on the ground. And it was, we would say, a Confederate victory. Here we go. First Battle of Bull Run. So yeah, up there, DC's over here, so it's to the west of DC. The first Battle of Bull Run was a Confederate victory. Stonewall Jackson was the Confederate leader who led his troops to drive back Union soldiers at that time. And what this war did was it brought out the reality of the war to the forefront. Your textbook mentions that on the day of this battle, you had senators, because remember, it's close to Washington, D.C., you had senators and congressmen and even citizens pack up lunches and go watch this battle begin. They thought it was going to be short and sweet and not that violent. So this battle brought home the reality of war, and it was a victory for the Confederates. Another battle that I want you to be aware of, or I'm just going to mention, the ones that I want you to be aware of are the Battle of Bull Run. This next one, you don't have to be aware of it. Actually, you do need to, sorry. It's on page 496, the Battle of New Orleans. So New Orleans is a major port city for the Confederates. They have a lot of cotton shipped down the Mississippi River and then brought into New Orleans and then taken out for exports. New Orleans is also the largest city at the time for the Confederates. So the Battle of New Orleans was April 25th through May 1st. So it would have been going on, 157 years ago today. This was a Union victory as they captured New Orleans, and they were able to gain control of the port and the Mississippi River. So that was a victory for the Union. A little over a month later, June 25th through July 1, you have the 7 days battles, or the Peninsula Campaign. This is where the Confederates have another victory. We're going to stop here. Started down with a general coming down the Potomac River, coming into the Chesapeake Bay area, wanting to basically try to get to Richmond, coming down the peninsulas here. The Confederates under General Robert E. Lee turned back the Unionist armies, and they were able to protect Richmond from Union invasion. We'll stop there. There was just 2 more battles I wanted to cover. We'll cover them first thing Thursday and then pick up with the second half of the war. Any questions? All right. Yeah. No. Have a great afternoon and a great Wednesday. We'll see you Thursday morning.